I'm a bit nervous with this technology, and I'm also a bit concerned that you probably don't know more about the canal and the river than I do. So I was going to talk really just about the Chelmer, and the Chelmer I talk about Hoe Mill, but apart from that, really only down to Barnes Mill. I honestly don't know all the marriages who milled on the Chelmer. Our old millwright, you'll see a picture of him. He was into this sort of thing and said at one time there were 13 marriages with mills on the Chelmer, but I've never been able to count that many. He might have counted the windmills that went with the water mills, but I was just going to cover the history of the family and how it came to be in Chelmsford. Probably we were Huguenots who, you're probably better at history than I am, but when Henry VIII abolished or started the Church of England so he could divorce, who was it he divorced? Someone? Yes, to marry Anne Boleyn. I think that set off a bit of a hiatus in other places, and in France the Protestants were persecuted and a lot were massacred, and so there was a big exodus of Huguenots from France, not just to England. There was a far bigger exodus than Poles or anyone coming to England, or in percentage terms, in percentage of the population terms, but I can't prove that we were Huguenots. But some, if I get this to work, right, yeah. So I think that a lot of the Huguenots were quite wealthy in France, quite well educated, and according to some people, some of the marriages who may have come from France were quite at high levels in society. And this is just a crest that someone found of the marriage family. Okay, so the first marriage we know about was Francis' marriage, who was a Quaker, and I think he was very early Quaker, probably because they were non-conformist Protestants. And he lived in Stebbing. He had 4 sons, I think, and I think most of them were farmers. I think they probably were all farmers. I think one was killed in a hunting accident, and one came to Broomfield. So Francis, I don't think we know when he was born, but I can tell you he died. Oh no, I can't tell you when he died. I'll tell you his son died. His son William came to Broomfield, and they lived at Partridge Green, which is up behind the hospital. And they were farmers, but I think at some point they started milling. Now, you'll find there's dozens of William marriages in this talk. You'll get fairly sick of it. But Francis was quite interesting. He got sent to prison twice, once for refusing to pay tithes and once for getting married in a Quaker ceremony, which was illegal in those days, but later people relaxed and you're allowed to get married in a Quaker meeting now. So Williams, I don't know much about him, but his wife, Ruth, outlived him by about 30 years. When she died, the weather was very bad. It was either so bad that she couldn't get into Chelmsford to the Quaker burial ground to be buried, or she didn't want her staff to try to take her there. And so she was buried under an apple tree in her orchard, and she's still there today. It's in a hedge up behind Partridge Green Farm. And that's my father standing by the grave. Now, on this side, this is Partridge Green. You see, it's up behind the hospital is here now. And the mills that we milled in, Croxton's, I think, is the mill that we started milling in. And each water mill tended to have a windmill. So Croxton's had one, which is in where Aylett's is now. I mean, I've never seen it or seen a picture of it, but I believe it was a bit like the Turling windmill, a hexagonal windmill. And they didn't tend to last very long because it was hard to waterproof the corner joints. You know, the water got in at the corners. So Digby's mill was the windmill by Broomfield Mill. And then we come down to Bishop's Hall Mill, Chelmer Mill, where we still mill, Mulch Mill, and Mulch had a windmill out in the field in front of the house, and then Barnes Mill, which is really where all the millers started. So William, Francis' son William, he had one son, another William, and a daughter. And the son of the William was the one who first went to Barnes Mill, and I think that they were probably milling at Croxton's then, and his son, they had four Williams sons who all died, and then in infancy, and then they gave up and had a Joseph, and he survived, and the Joseph is our sort of ancestor, and then he had another William who went to Broomfield Mill. So the first mill they milled at is Croxton's Mill, and this is looking at Croxton's Mill, I should think in the 30s, and it was getting a bit run down. I think it just sort of had its day a bit. So that's where we started milling. Then William, I hope you don't find it a bit of a bore, but William wanted to speak about the Chelmer. So I don't know if you know, but the Chelmer rises over here near Saffron Walden, near Carver Barracks in this wood. And this is the Chelmer coming up here. And the Blackwater rises up at Seaward's End, up there. So they are only about 2.5 miles apart when they start. Here's a bit closer the view that the river runs into the wood. And so Angela and I had an expedition to find the source. And here's the river coming up this ditch. I mean, it's just really a ditch by then. And here's Angela hunting for the source. And now she thinks she's found something that looks good. And it's rather nice, rather nice spring-fed pond, but we couldn't really see that it connected with the ditch at all. So I think we've got to go from the Ordnance Survey map, and that's the start of the Chelmer. It's not quite so exciting, is it? And but now this is the start of the Blackwater, look. Well, it's the Pant, isn't it? It's the Pant, and this appears. Well, we don't actually start in the sewage works, but it's pretty close. But we've never been to there, and so the Pant runs down to Braintree, and then it changes into the Blackwater. Apparently, it changed into the Blackwater because in Bocking there was a textile mill, and it changed all the water black. Is that your understanding, Roy? So, but I wasn't. And the Pant gets a lot more attention than the Chelmer from the Water Authority, and this is because of the Ely scheme, and water comes up from the or down from the fens, whichever, and some of it is put into the Blackwater and pumped, I think, to Hanningfield, and then but I think most of it goes into Abberton Reservoir. So a lot of the water we get for drinking water has actually come from the ooze, and that's why I think the Blackwater is more carefully cared for than the Chelmer, that they don't really seem to care about much. So now this is the mills at Chelmsford. We start off with Hertford End Mill, which was a Ridley mill, and it's sort of in behind where the brewery is or was beside the road. This was a mill that's no longer there, but the traces of it are. Then Great Waltham, there was a mill in Langley's, I think, a small one, and we were going to start with some very good map, is it? With this one in Little Waltham. Now, the mills on this part of the Chelmer have about 5 foot fall on all of them, and these are the 15-metre contours where they cross the river. Obviously, it doesn't fall evenly between them, but you can see there is about 3 mills in each contour. Do you see what I mean? So they're roughly 5 foot 5-foot head, and just so they had breast shot wheels. So when you go to Wales and you see a little wheel about this wide and 14 foot high, and it's an overshot wheel where the water goes over the top of the wheel and the weight of the water turns the wheel, you can get quite high power outputs from them. You'll find they're giving sort of 14 or 15 horsepower, easily equal to what the mills like Broomfield would get, but they got more power by damming the water up. So the next one would be an undershot wheel, which weren't very efficient, and they were just turned by the water pushing on the paddles. And so there's a more efficient developed, and these are breast shot, and this is the sort of wheel that are on most of the mills on the Chelmer. The Victoria Road Mill had a turbine in it, which was a more modern version, more efficient, but I don't think it ever worked properly. I don't think it was ever properly sized or installed properly. And I think Sanford Mill had 2, as far as I know. But anyway, all the mills we're going to look at would have had breast shot wheels, and I think they would have had about a 5-foot head on them. So the first one we were going to look at was Little Waltham, which we never milled at Little Waltham. And I thought I'd mention it because it's quite a pretty little mill. And I thought that I'll show you a picture of the structure. I thought that the floodgates and everything and weir were built across the original river, and then they cut a way into the mill. But if you look at this map, it doesn't what it shows, is it? But when you look at the picture, you'll see what I mean. That there's a weir, and the gates went across the Chelmer, and the water went off to the side, which is different to the other mills. This was it in its heyday. This is looking from the north, so the water's going into the wheel under there. And obviously, it had a little steam mill, but it didn't last. And here's the house after the mill has been knocked down. You can see where the mill fixed onto the side of the house there. And there are some pictures in Harvey Benham's book of it being knocked down, but that's all it's showing. And this is the weir I was talking about, and the floodgates, and the water's going, well, it doesn't go down there now, but it would go down behind that alder tree to the mill. And I think that's different to the other structures. The next one is Croxton's Mill, which you saw the picture of. And I think this is definitely the earliest one we milled in. Certainly, I think the Joseph, who was the son of the second William, he milled there, and I suspect that one or other of the 2 Williams, or both, milled there. It's on the main river, look, and then it had a sluice. And when I was little, this mill pond was very attractive, and it used to have dozens of people round it. But of course, it turned into a house and now an office, and this has all been fenced off, and it's spoiled it a bit. And probably the most interesting thing, I think, is, do you see the ford with that big loop in it? And the water from the wheel would scour the riverbed, you see. And so it was very deep just there. And if the horses tried to go straight across, they'd go out of their depths, and you'd have a problem. And there's a row going on at the moment because the 4-wheel drive people are trying to reopen this. I hope they don't manage it, because it's not, there's just a huge bank to go up and make a terrible mess. But the next one is a bit politically incorrect nowadays, but this is, you can see where the track has been fenced off to stop the horses going into the deep water. And these are otter hounds. that are hunting the river for otters, which certainly wouldn't be approved of nowadays, would it? And then we come to Broomfield Mill, which is where I live, and William lives just at the top of the hill, just there. It's quite interesting because they are very self-sufficient. If you look, here's Broomfield Mill. Here you can see they've cut off across the. Here is the old river, and it used to go through there, wind up there, and join back on there. I think you can see where it ran. And it had its windmill at the top, and it also had a saw pit there, and there was a blacksmith there. So they could do pretty well anything. When I was young, there was still a wheelwright working up there, and I can remember him sawing out cart shafts with a handsaw, and it took a couple of days sawing with a handsaw to saw each shaft out. Right, so the first one to mill here was William Marriage, and I think he was the third William Marriage who bought it from, I think there's someone called Dixon who'd milled there before, and I think he'd gone bankrupt, and then they sold the whole mill. I think the house was probably built by this William. If you look on the old maps, there's only a mill there, but no house. And so and if you look on the mill sale particulars, there's no house, just a brand house. So I think the house isn't as old as I had thought it was. There's an interesting thing. In the Domesday Book, it mentions Broomfield Mill. I don't call it Broomfield Mill, and it has 14.5 acres of meadows with it. And if you add these meadows here with it, that it's still got, that comes to 14.5 acres. So it probably hasn't altered much since the Domesday Book, I suspect. So this is Broomfield Mill in its heyday. You can see the steam mill here. We'll talk about that. And that's a Fred Spalding picture, a postcard. And here's the windmill that went with it. Obviously, this is when it's seen rather better days before it was demolished. But all this timber here is associated with the sort of wood yard they had, and there was a saw pit. And just to the right was the wheelwright's shop where they made the wagons. And the roof of one bit of it was the purlins were windmill sails, but they weren't off this windmill. I don't know what they were off, but it didn't match this windmill. And this is just, for a long time, the farms and the mills were all run as one partnership. So here you can see there's a mill lorry helping with the harvest, and that guy there, he's Fred Harvey. He was the last blacksmith in the smithy. This one next to him is called George Beard, who worked for us for over 50 years. I think he was probably a bit wild when he was young, and he was set on temporary by my grandfather, one harvest, and stayed for 50 years. So here's Brookfield Mill when it was the water mill, and the big change came with this bit on this side, which was the steam mill. And the steam mill went in, I think in 1836. By this time, the William Marriage, the third, has died. He had twin sons who were William and Henry. And when he died, I think they were 15 or 16, and they took over the company, and we're William's descendants, and James and Simon and people who met them are Henry's descendants. And so that's where the W&H started. And they were quite advanced. They were still farming, and they farmed quite, on that very first slide with the pictures of the mills, it's got some of the farms they had, but they farmed a pretty large area. And so this was the first time, wasn't it, when they didn't use sustainable power. This is the start of all the carbon emissions. And of course, it made a hell of a difference, because for the first time, they weren't reliant on wind or water. If you had too much wind or too little wind, you couldn't use a windmill, and you have too much water or too little water, you couldn't run a water wheel. They just won't run if the tail race backs up. So now we're coming down. This is Bishop's Hall Mill. It's not a very good picture, but it comes from another picture of Bishop's Hall, which is just to the left-hand side. So you can see it had a steam mill, and you can't see it very well, but this burnt down in 1930. But this was run by a succession of marriages, and I really don't know who they all were. If you look at the picture of Bishop's Hall Mill, I think it's taken from probably Hoffman's factory when it was first built, and it's looking up towards Swiss Avenue, and there's nothing. I think you can see one house, which I suspect is the caretaker's house on the Quaker burial ground on Broomfield Road. There's no houses at all. There's nothing, just meadows going up to the Broomfield Road. This is Bishop's Hall. I think it was a very nice house, probably one of the nicest ones in Chelmsford. When my grandparents were first married, they lived there, and then it was taken back by Hoffman's. You'll see what happened to it in a minute or two. And moved to Broomfield Mill. And my granny said she cried when she had to move to Broomfield Mill, but it's not that bad. But anyway, it obviously wasn't as good as Bishop's Hall. This is looking at from this view is looking towards the river, away from Broomfield Road. Right. So now we're not on the Chelmer now, but this is Chalmer Mill when it was built. It was built in 1900, and it cost just over £11,000. I think it cost 11,270 or some trivial amount like that. And it's just a steam mill, so there's no water. This is a tower for silos for the wheat. Here's the boiler house, and here's the engine shed. And then obviously it had the chimney, and it did have the stone in that bit of the chimney that had come from Broomfield Mill, I think. I've got it now. When they knocked the chimney down, I rescued it out of a pile of rubble. But I think it's got the stone from the 1836 chimney got put into that one. When they, things go wrong now, don't they? But when they bought the boiler had to be delivered by rail. So it was, you can see it was pretty big, and the railway lost it, and they lost it completely. And the insurance paid up, and they bought another boiler, and eventually they found it in a siding somewhere, covered up with a tarpaulin. I don't know what happened to it. So not everything went smoothly in those days. So for those of you who don't know, here's Chelsea, here's the goods yard, and you can't see it because it's got this zoom bit on top of it, but the mill is just there, just about where the Ian Share is. And obviously it was built because of the railway. So it's all to do with transport, isn't it? Here we had the canal, and we have Mulcham where they got coal up, and there was gasworks, and Brown's timber yard was the last thing to use the canal. But when the railway came, it really transformed the thing. And so there was Crompton's down here. There's Ridley's had a flour mill there. Marconi's built their new factory there. Hoffman's, again, you can't see it, built their factory there. Really much smaller way, built our mill there. And all of these things had direct links to the railway, and for bringing in coal, and Hoffman's and Marconi's delivered stuff out by rail. So here's the mill, I think probably in late 1920s. You can see wagons with grain in that would be tipped in here and put into the silo. You can see the coal. Millers tended to be coal merchants as well. So anyone had a steam engine and had to get coal in was a coal merchant. So if you saw agricultural, it was namely fertilizer, feed and coal or something like that. And we had coal business and sold coal around Chelmsford for quite a while. And here's a view from the air, similar sort of time. You can see the trucks there and the coal. That little building there, there's 2 steam lorries used to live in that, and you'll see them in a later picture. And Bishop's Hall was about there, and I think they knocked it down. Obviously, Hoffman's and Marconi's were pretty critical infrastructure in both wars, and so I don't think they'd worry about the odd house. But you can see we were in the middle of 60 acres of heavy industry, really. This is the roller mill when I was at school. These rolls are newer, but down the far end were the original rolls that were put in. They were put in by Henry Simon, who was a milling engineer in Stockport, but they were actually Swiss. They were Bühler rolls from Switzerland, and he put his own plate on them. And so they're badged as Henry Simon, but they were all metric. They weren't imperial, and they were pretty good rolls. They ran for 100 years, 24 hours a day, with very, very little trouble. But eventually, they were, they hadn't got the capacity that was required. This roll here is a Turner roll. You probably can't see it. It says ER&F Turner from Ipswich. They were very good milling engineers, and this roll father bought out of Ridley's Mill, the one by the railway when it shut, and I helped our millwright put that in when I was at my school holidays. So the first break roll would cut the wheat open. So the wheat isn't just smashed up, it's torn open. And then as it goes down through the rolls, you have break rolls, which are concentrating on getting the flour out of the wheat. So some of them are scraping the flour off the bran. And then there are other rolls that grind the white endosperm semolina down to flour. And each time it's ground, it's taken up to the top of the mill, sieved, split up, and it's a sort of art how you get it out. But that's a very brief description of how you get it out. The next change was the steam engine went, and we had an electric motor put in, and you can see the belts here that are driving onto the line shafts that the steam engine drove. I think the steam engine was 120 horsepower, and this was a 150 horsepower motor, and it was wound up in Chelmsford at Crompton's. I'd met the guy once who wound it. I can't remember where he was or who he was, but he announced, "Oh, I wound that motor," and it ran for a long, long time with very, very little trouble. And it was installed by Frank Christie, who was a Christie from Christie Brothers and Christie Norris. He was an electrical engineer, and he was a very good electrical engineer. He put in some hydroelectric power plants in the west of England when they had local power supply companies, and he put in some hydroelectric power plants in sites that were thought to be uneconomic, and I think they're still running today. Now this is Jess. He's the one I told you about, said how many mills there were on the Chelmer and this sort of thing. He was a millwright, and I'll show you where he was apprenticed. And he was very cross about this picture, so I thought I'd put it in because it's quite good of him. But if you're trying to dress a millstone, you can't dress it with the light shining straight down on it because you can't see what you're doing. My cousin took this and he was mortally offended. He went on and on about this picture because it got used quite extensively and he thought it was complete rubbish. And he was apprenticed in Saxton Mill. So this is in Suffolk. It's worth going to see. Well, I haven't been there for a long time, but he showed me round it. And he was apprenticed in there when he was 16. And then he ran a business repairing windmills and water mills, but eventually trade got a bit short. And the last job he did before he came to us, he renovated it for the Ministry of, or I don't know what it's called now, but he renovated it for the ministry. So it was actually renovated by the guy who was apprenticed in it, 60 years, 50 years earlier. And it's very interesting. Unless it's deteriorated, it's well worth a look. And we got him because we made stone ground wholemeal flour. We made it till we shut Mulch, we made all the stone ground wholemeal flour through the wall there. And then we took the stones out from here and we used them in Chalmer Mill. This has all got painted blue. I think it should look better when it was timber, but the stones are in there, the grain's shaken in the top, and then it comes out the side and it's sucked away and unpacked. And these stones are French Burr, which were generally accepted to be the best stones for milling wheat. You can see they're made up out of lots of little bits of stone, and this stone was mined in the Paris Basin. And the reason it's very hard, it'll cut glass, you get a bit of a sharp edge on it, and it's also porous, so the stones didn't blind up, so they'd stay sharp with a sharp edge. This one's the runner. This is the one that goes round, and it's going to be put on top of this one, which is the bed stone, and it's driven by that shaft there. They look a bit crude, but they actually have to be very carefully set up. If you have a wheel out of balance on a car, the wheel wobbles. And if you have that happen with a millstone, it will smack into the stone at the bottom and you'll have the mill burn down or a dust explosion or something. So that stone's got the spin above the stone below, just, the distance of the particle of flour apart. And the wheat's fed in here, and there's a bit more room round the eye of the stone, and that tears it open, and then it's reduced down as it goes out, and eventually it goes off the side of the stone, and then it's sucked away to be packed. And Simon here is dressing the stone. Here's a closer view of him. You don't hit the stone, they just drop that mill bill on it. I don't know if you can see, but it's got a hard tip in there. We would buy hard tips now and braze them in. But in the old days, the blacksmith would make them and he'd harden the metal. And the expression that, see someone's metal was a milling expression. You can see where he's dropping this. If that shattered, you get little bits stick in the back of your hand and it would look a bit like tattoos, little spots tattooed on. And so if you looked at a miller's hands, you said, so show me your metal, and you look at your hands and you'd get an idea of how bad your blacksmith was or how much work you'd done dressing stones. And he's dressing these, so there's the deep furrows and then there's little grooves, about 10 grooves per inch that are just broken into the top of the stone. And that's what he's doing. It's quite a long-winded job. A lot of stone ground wholemeals made with modern stones, with carborundum sort of stones, but I don't think they make quite such good stuff. And of course, the whole plant now, this is in the feed mill, but the whole plant are now computer controlled. So this particular machine, the feed mill, it will know all the products that it's had into the bins. It will know what it's weighed into every ration that it's made. So if you bring a ticket of your layers food in, we can tell you, who made it, who packed it, what went in it, where the product came from, where the soya came from, probably where the wheat came from. Then it will track everything through the plant. And if anything happens, it records. If something goes wrong or someone fiddles with something, it will log it so you can trace what has happened to the production. And there's similar, this is a feed computer, but they actually use the same one in the flour mill. Feed mill computer systems are quite advanced because they use computers to work out the formulations for animal feed. You're considering maybe 30 different nutrient things in 30 different ingredients, and you can't do it in your head. But optimization programs can, and they use feed formulation as a sort of example in training people in optimization. And of course, it continues. This guy packs all our packet flour. So he's putting here, he's just putting the bags into these magazines, and then it drops the flour in, shakes it in, folds the top down, glues it, metal detects it, check weighs it, codes it, and it goes through there and it's stretch wrapped, and then it goes onto a pallet, and nobody touches it, and then you take the pallet off and it goes on the lorry. When you couldn't get flour during COVID, about 4%, I think, of the flour that's made is packed in small bags, and there's not very many mills do it. And of course, you're driven down on price. You can see that's quite efficient, and it will run. Sometimes it will run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That plant, just because we're busy for some reason. And when you have a 400% increase in demand for packet flour, it's just impossible. That's why you saw pallets of 16-kilo bags in Sainsbury's and things, because there's enough packing capacity. But the height of the thing, when you couldn't buy a 1.5-kilo bag of flour, if you wanted 28 tons blown in through your living room window, they could have done that the next day. So this is Chelmer Mill today. You can still see the mill. This was built by another Chelmsford architect, Chancellor, muddle up here. But I'm sure he would have done it if it had been there at the time. And I think he was mayor of Chelmsford twice, and he did quite a lot of buildings. And this actually was a very well designed, very well thought out building. But it's been a bit hacked around over the sort of 120 years it's been in use, and it's probably making 6 times what it was designed to make. And we make flour for bakers and flour for pizzas and things. The bakers, you think there's not a proper baker in Chelmsford, is there? And it's the county town. They have died out quite substantially, but we make a lot of specialist domestic flours, and we make quite a lot of specialist animal feeds, and we've got a plant now in Lincolnshire that makes wild bird food, which we couldn't put in Chelmsford. So that's Chalmer Mill. Now we go down, the next one was Mulcham, where we are now, and obviously we're sitting in just in here. You can see there's no windows above that level, and that's because the top was all bins, and they pull the wheat up on a chain in a sack. We'll see some of the sacks in a minute, and then they tip it in the bins, and then it would flow down through the mill to be crushed or ground, whatever. And so you'll see on all the mills, the top floor, there's no windows because they're all bins. And if you look on the back, you can see here the steam mill that was built. I think there was a steam mill before, but I think this one was built in 1890. It was a roller mill like Chelmer Mill, and it was built first. They built this one first, and you can see here the back of it. This is the boiler room, and that's the engine room, and here's the chimney. There's the wheelhouse, and we'll come on to Mulcham in a little while longer, but Mulcham was actually on the Cannon the Wid. It wasn't on the Chelmer. So this is the Chelmer coming past here, but I'll show you later how Mulcham could run on the Chelmer. So it could run on the Chelmer and on the Cannon the Wid. And if you look here, you can see the boiler and the steam gauge. And now, of course, the engine room is the last testament, isn't it? The escape rooms, and the boiler room is the Guardian. And I think they're meant to be the most popular tourist things in Chelmsford. So that is Mulcham. Now, Barnes Mill, there's a sort of pretty picture of it. Here's a more realistic one. Barnes Mill was where it was first taken by William Marriage, he was the third William, and he had Joseph then lived there and had quite a lot of children. I'm not sure how many, But if you read, you might have had 12 or 13 or 14. Most of them went off starting mills in other places. So the son William went to Broomfield, and they went to Bury St Edmunds and Pakenham Mill as a marriage. And then one of the sons had Hoe Mill down the river. That's, I think it was one of his sons, not the grandson. It's quite complicated. It's a bit hard to get your head around. So that was really what, that really had a proliferation of marriages milling because they had so many children, I think. Now I was going to go down to Hoe Mill. And there's three things I want to look at Hoe Mill. Here also is Hoe Mill. There's not much trace of it now. And I was just talking about Sugar Hole or whatever you call it. And just up here, and these were all marriage enterprises. So here's a picture Williams provided of Hoe Mill. It's not a very good one, but it was the best we could do. So it was quite a big mill. And I think that Robert Marriage ran this from 1860, I think, to 1920, something like that. And you can see it had steam, and it was a pretty big mill. And that's really all I know about it. What I was going to talk to you about was, I've got lost here. This is Sugar Hole, and this Robert had a son called Robert and a son called James. And at Sugar Hole, they built the first sugar beet factory in the country. If you hear British Sugar telling you it was a cant, you'll be able to put them right. It was built down here. They were Quakers and they didn't approve of the slave trade. And their idea was that they would produce homegrown sugar and that would finish the slave trade. Didn't quite work out. But they went to France where there was quite a lot of homegrown sugar production, and still is. You see the big French sugar factories, don't you? You drive across France. And they brought over two Frenchmen who knew about sugar, and they built the sugar factory just here. And it only ran for 2 years. I think they probably hadn't got enough finance. And also it was a bit like today where we leave the common market so that people can still use offshore funds and things, don't we? And I think there was a vested interest in the slave trade, and people weren't, you know, there was questions raised about whether British sugar was as good as, you know, imported sugar. And of course it's just sugar. So it wouldn't have made any difference. And when this failed, they had another go at it, and they built a sugar beet factory in Chelsea, on the river in Chelsea. Obviously, there wasn't so much building there then, and they had a contract, and they grew the sugar beet in Wandsworth. And this is Wandsworth. Yeah, I think it's Wandsworth. But again, that didn't work. There was a lot stacked against it, and they didn't manage to stop the slave trade. Right. One of my staff brought me a brick. I said, look, there's a marriage brick in our chimney. And I didn't know that there was any such thing as a marriage brick. And I asked my father, oh, yes, he said, that's Hugh Marriage down at Alting. And he said that him and Diana, his older sister, had gone down, must have been quite little, had gone down to Alting, you see, in a pony trap to see Hugh Marriage. And the wheel had come off the pony trap. And it crashed, you see, and the horse had broken, or the pony had broken out of the shafts, and it was a bit of a disaster. And Fred Harvey, the blacksmith you saw in that picture, had gone down and he put the wheel back on. And the pony was scared to go in the shafts, you see. And what Fred Harvey did, he got a handful of grit from the road and shoved it in the horse's mouth. And while the horse was busy trying to spit the grit out, it forgot it was scared of the shafts, and he hitched it up, and they went, and Fred Harvey said he'd seen a gypsy do that. Then I got another brick, you see, which said Marriage Hatfield. I thought it must be one in Hertfordshire, but I don't think it was. Only because I was looking and I found this, you see, Hugh marriages listed in Kelly's 1899-1922 editions at Hatfield, Witham. So it's Hatfield House there, isn't it? Hatfield Peveril. So I think that those are both his bricks. And he, I think, because I think he was just here on this corner, just by this is the Turk coming down here. He was just on this corner. I only think this because it's the only brickworks I can find. And there it is, look, just by the Turk. And of course, there's no trace of it now. If you look, I don't know if you can see, but you can see the brickworks under a Google map. And you can't really see, I wonder, there's a big pond there. I don't have no idea. Some of you may know more than me, but whether this is where they dug the clay. But they obviously made bricks for quite a while. And these bricks were in quite a big sort of estate of houses in Witham. So that was another thing that the marriages did that was, well, that was on the term, or wasn't it, not the Chelmer. Now, transport, I said, was critical, wasn't it? The canal and the railways. And then we went to road. And here you can see at Mulch, these are 2 steam lorries. And here's a wagon like the one you saw at Broomfield Mill. Now, these wagons would go up to London, you see. And here you can see, I think that's probably wheat. But those wheat sacks would weigh 16 stone. And if it was beans, it would weigh 18 stone. And if it was flour, it would weigh 280 pounds. What's that? Can't work it out. But anyway, they were quite heavy that they had to carry. Now, manual handling says you can't carry more than 16 kilos, doesn't it? But they carry these. And of course, there weren't many to a ton. So, and if you pull them up the loop, I've done it here when I first started, you can get one from the front of the lorry, put the chain on it, and you can pull it so it's kind of to the back of the lorry and pull it up. You can get a ton off very quickly, actually. But these would go up to London, say with flour, and they'd start off early, and then they'd unload, and then they'd have lunch or get in the pub. And on the way back, they might go to sleep in the back of the wagon, and the horses knew the way home. But they weren't meant to do this. It was called being asleep in charge of a wagon. And the police would have a sort of like a radar trap, perhaps outside the village. And if they caught you asleep in the back of the wagon, you'd be in trouble. And one time this happened. They weren't stopped by the police, but the horses got it into their head they'd got to deliver into a baker in Malden. And apparently you had to turn the wagon around on the sea wall, and it was pretty tricky. And the horses tried this on their own with the guys asleep in the back, and the whole lot went over the sea wall. And I should think there was probably a bit of a row about it. So these are steam lorries. These are folding lorries. They were the sort of next stage. They had their moments because they were very heavy, and the roads weren't really up to coping with things as heavy as that. So quite often the road would give way and they'd slide into the ditch, and they'd have to go out with jacks and timber and jack them back out and send them on their way. But we had 2 of those, and I think by that time they were living up at Chelmer. Then the lorries got bigger, you see, and now we have these horrendous juggernauts that you all see and curse. And you think they're really environmentally unfriendly. But if you look next door to us, the mill, we've got this motor factor, and they've got these environmentally friendly little vans, mostly with pretty girls driving the parts round to the garages. And I don't know if you've ever thought how many of those you would need to do what that lorry's doing. But it's quite a lot. You need about 120 little vans to shift what you shift in one lorry. And of course, the impact of that would be vastly greater than a lorry. So the lorries are actually quite efficient. And even when we've looked at getting organic wheat from abroad, you've got to go right into Russia before it's cheaper to get it on the rail than to get it on a lorry, you know, a lorry delivering it. They are more efficient than people think. Anyway, that's just me, you know, defending ourselves. Now, I was going to just talk about some of the changes that have happened. Now, this is the plan sale particulars when the Mildmay estate was sold. And here's Mulch Mill. And if you look, there's nothing between Mulch Mill and the prison. So there's quite a few changes, isn't there? There's no, you know, road here. There's no Army and Navy. And interestingly here, these strips, the meadows, these meadows and the next lot of meadows down were communally grazed. And people owned strips, and that gave them a right to have so much grazing on it. And they were run by a committee with a chairman, and they would lay down when you could go. You could go in at a certain date and cut the hay. And then after a month, I think it was, you were allowed to put the cattle in, and the cattle were just mob grazed over the whole area, you see. Well, not, I think this bit probably went with Mulch Mill, but here, and I think these sort of anomalies with ownership arose because they'd all get in the pub and decide to swap strips with each other, and I don't think it was very carefully recorded, so it's quite hard to actually prove title on some of it. But that's the remnants of the strips, and they were all marked out. I've never found one, but they were all marked out with cast iron labels on the meads, you know, where the strips were. Here now, this is Mulch Mill, which is when we bought it. I think we'd been renting it for some time before we actually bought it. And you may notice this little bit of yellow up here is part of Mulch Mill. And this is the Chelmer coming down here. And this is the Cannon the Wind, and it goes under the stone bridge. And so that feeds the Chelmer. But here, there were some gates called Taverner's Gates. And I don't know if you can see, there was a cut through here. So it connected the Chelmer to the Cannon the Wind. And if you shut these gates, the Chelmer was forced through to run down here. And so you could run Mulch Mill on both rivers. And I said some of these structures were very old. And if you look on this is a walk map of 1591, I think. And if you look here, you can see here is the cut, and it's called the gullet. So it had been there for a long while. It wasn't a new thing. And here you can see it in a picture. Here are the gates. Look, this is the meadow, Belmead. Is it called Belmead? And then it had circuses on it in those days, and you can see the gullet coming through here, and it went out. This is where Cater House is now, and it went out into the Cannon the Wind just here. And at that time, Mulch Mill had the water. This guy here is John Marriage, who I think was the founder or founder member of the Chelmsford Canoe Club, and it's him who wrote all the books on Chelmsford. You know, the books with pictures, quite interesting. And that's him in the canoe there. And here you can see the side of the mill. You can see the wastewater coming out from the Cannon the Wind into the Chelmer. And here's the wheelhouse where the water wheel was sort of in the middle of in there, and it drove into the mill just on the floor below. So what happened to it? Why did it all vanish? Well, this is why. Chelmsford has always flooded, and this was the 1958 flood, which was quite bad. You can see, look, here's Goldlay House and Baddow Road, and you can see the water way beyond Baddow Road, and this is Sads, John Sads. This flood came from the Baddow Brook, which ran, this is the Baddow Brook, and it ran up Baddow Road, and when all the houses went in, you see there's unmitigated surface water flows and huge amounts of water go down there. Under the Army and Navy roundabout, there's a sort of arrangement of pipes that looks like a Christmas tree. You ever see a picture of it? It's quite extraordinary. But worse than that, of course, the thing that Chelmsford is keenest on is shopping, and that's the High Street, but that's where Cater House was, and Woolworths is just up to the left, or was, and so couldn't have that. So it was decided that something must be done. So the River Board produced a scheme. So here is the here was the existing Chelmer and the existing Cannon the Wid, and the stone bridge is just here. And so basically what they did, they just put a concrete channel for the Chelmer and a concrete channel for the Cannon the Wid through Chelmsford. It was just bigger than they could possibly conceive a flood flow being. And they took out Taverner's gates and they put the automatic gates that are just over there in here, and the water was moved. So you can see here's Mulcham and where the water used to go. And I should think this argument was probably to do with water rights, because you probably know with the canal, millers were very troublesome about their water rights when they built the canal. William says that Barnes Mill, they got 3p a barge that went through to compensate them for the loss of water to the mill, but it wasn't index linked, and so by now it wasn't really worth collecting anymore. Yeah, and that's just Taverner's gates where they took them out. And then this is just a picture of the gullet before it was all filled in. So that's about it. William wanted me to say something about riparian owners. So we're a riparian owner, and it has its pluses and minuses. Our house never flooded. It's possible, we've done some flood modelling, and it's possible that it could be vulnerable if you take the 40% increase in flows. If you take the very worst case, it could be vulnerable. So we probably have to do something about that. But if you're a riparian owner, you're on a hiding to nothing, because you're supposed to do everything and pay for the Environment Agency to do it as well. And anything you want to do, you have to get their permission for. And it's a bit of a, well, I won't get started. But we replaced the floodgates. Oh, this is, well, the lad who was an apprentice when we did that has just retired. So it's probably quite a while ago. And we replaced these with brick, with, you know, but we replaced it with reinforced concrete. And this is one of the pieces of timber that the floodgates were on a timber frame with brick built in. And although above the ground it was getting a bit rotten, below the ground, this is one of the tenons. I don't know if it's good enough to see, but it's pretty well like new. And one of these bits of timber I left in the yard at home until it dried out, and then we used it for a mantelpiece in the house, and it's been, you know, you never forget it's been underwater for 100 years. But in front of it, I think that they put these gates behind the old gates that had been there. So they built the new gates behind the old gates and then took the old gates out. And there was a big piece of oak. It was all rotten. It was about 18 by 12. It was a very big piece of oak. And it was on like piles. They were really more like fence posts tenoned into it. And it was a hell of a job to get it off these piles. And when we got it off, in the top of one of the tenons, it was all pink and dry. So, I mean, it must have been under there 200 years, I should think. And the water had never got into the very top piece of one of the tenons. So this is pretty well it now. Please here. So Mulch Mill, here's a picture of it. Probably this is probably its heyday, and this is a photograph of the picture that the South African person has got, and I'm afraid I can't tell you who it is. The letter that they sent has got lost, but you can see the windmill here, and there's no viaduct over the river or anything, and just the meadows. It's quite an interesting picture. And when we stopped milling here, we spent, for royal no, we spent a long time trying to get planning permission to do something with it. And whatever we wanted to do, there was some problem. It would increase the traffic on Parkway, or it would do something. And the place got into a terrible state, and the house got vandalized. The fireplaces got stolen in the house, and the stairs got smashed, which was a bit of a pity. We had done the roof up here. You can see, else it would have just fallen down, and you can see the wheelhouse did fall down. But eventually we did it up. We didn't have planning permission. We did it with listed building consent, and then the council had to decide whether to chuck everyone out or give it planning permission, and they decided they'd give it planning permission, and it's been, it's done what we hoped it would do. It sort of provides an easy way if you're a small business to get in. You don't have to have a lease, you just pay a deposit and you can come in and pay your rent. And we've got one person who's been here since the start now, only one. And you know, some go broke, some get too big and leave, but one has been here the whole time. And there's usually about 40, 45 little businesses in here. And it's now got the local radio and the escape rooms and things. And it's managed by a charity who a Miller's House up the end of the place is a drop-in centre for children with learning difficulties. And if you have a look, they've done the garden. They were helped by Riffle College and by the contractors who built the new viaduct. And they did a walking tour of historic Chelmsford, which is quite the best thing thing like it I've seen. It's just a pamphlet if you ever find one, and it covers all the historic things in Chelmsford pretty well, and you can walk around and have a look. So that's Molsham. Here's Broomfield. So here's another view of Broomfield Mill with its steam engine. Then we moved to Chalmer Mill, and you can see here, actually, if you look here, you see that it had allotments out the back, but all that went after the Second World War, and now we are really tight on the site. This is our boundary here, and you can see all the industrial uses have gone. They're in the process of putting 85 flats in there. It's not near our boundary, it's on our boundary. There's 85 flats up that side, I'll show you. There's 85 flats in there, and this is the university. You can see, you can't quite see the Chancellor bit of the mill, that's newer bit, but here's the mill. And I find it a bit annoying because if we'd applied to build a flour mill and a feed mill, you know, next to 160 flats, 30 foot from the university and the police headquarters on our boundary at the back, in an area that's sort of 96% capacity for traffic at peak times, you'd be laughed out of the place, wouldn't you? But that's what's happened to us, and it's causing us quite a lot of problems. Not, you know, but just because there's no industrial land. And when we do more specialist products, we need more storage space, more packing space, and it's pretty challenging. And that's the end. So I don't know if I answer questions, if you've got any, or what.
First of all, I'd like to thank Peter for coming along and giving us a really nice talk tonight. So can we show our appreciation to Peter? It's a slight shame we had a few problems to start with, but once we got started, I think everyone's had an enjoyable evening with that. Now, we do have the opportunity to ask Peter some questions. So has anyone got any questions in the yes, sir?
On any of your sites, do you actually use the drop in the water level to generate electricity?
No, I wanted to put one in at Broomfield Mill, but yeah, it wasn't actually the Environment Agency that stopped it. It was the final straw was I was quite interested in doing this. I wanted to do it, and it's not really very economic. And the final straw was getting the feed-in tariff. But it turned out to get the feed-in tariff, you had to have an accredited contractor to build it, you see. So I said, well, where do I find an accredited contractor? Oh, well, we haven't got it, you see. So I said, all right, then, well, I'll get accredited. But that turned out to cost £10,000. And this was some while ago. So they said, well, I said, well, that's ridiculous. Well, I do this sort of thing all the time. Oh, yes, but the government are putting a lot of money into this, Mr. Marriage, and they want it. I said, well, they're not actually putting a lot of money in it, are they? Because it's being done with the fee which you pay in your electricity bills anyway. And I said, if it doesn't work, it won't cost them anything, will it? So I got the electricity sorted out. I think the Environment Agency.
I just asked.
Yeah.
I visited Croxton Mill several months ago, and they've got one there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually working.
Was it a screw turbine?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think they're good. And there's one up in Yorkshire that's been there a long while. And and they don't hurt the fish. And I reckon it would run with a flooded tail. And my idea was to put it in the side of the river and then let the tailwater go out under the weir and automate the weir so that it just kept at the same level all the time. And so it just fed as much through the turbine as it could do. But honestly, it's like swimming in treacle. And I just gave up in the end. It was quite expensive to do. But I mean, where we are, you could only, at low water, you only get about 3 kilowatts. I mean, I think you would get more than that. I was thinking of putting in a 15 kilowatt turbine. But it's not an overwhelming, but it would have made the house zero carbon, wouldn't it? Which would have been a step in the right direction. But I don't know, you find when you want to do these things, it's never quite as simple as you think. Well, I think it is simple, but we have the authorising officer comes out, you see, and she's got this drawing, and she's saying, now, where's this going, Mr. Marriage? I said, well, over there, by that bush. Oh, I see. All right, thank you. Now, they've asked me a question. Will the tail from the turbine scour a fish spawning ground? I said, well, no, because it's going to go out on the concrete exactly as it does now, isn't it? I see. Well, we'll see what they say about that. And I said, well, have you ever seen one of these guys? No, but we've been on a course. And it really, they had a questionnaire that you filled in, and it had a question. You had to tick yes or no, you see, and it had one which says, is it in an area that's likely to flood? Will it affect flooding, you see? So you could tick yes to one and no to the other. So you ticked both boxes on that question, and it really was quite difficult to do. I know people who put in bigger ones, and I was saying we weren't abstracting water because we weren't taking it out of the river, but where they do abstract it, it's even more difficult. I mean, they wouldn't accept. They said, well, we say you are abstracting it. And I said, well, it's not coming out of the river, is it? We're not abstracting it. But it really is surprisingly difficult.
Okay.
Sorry, really just a comment on marriage impact working with other local businesses. My father was a local builder, and he did a lot of work for Henry. Actually, on the school holidays, demolishing what were probably historic cottages to build new agricultural workers' dwellings. I learned to drive on one of the marriage fields. In the lorry. When I did my architectural training with a local practice in Chelmsford with Wiseman's, we did a lot of work for marriages, agricultural dwellings, alterations, etc. And then as you probably remember, when I worked for the Council of Historic Buildings as an advisor, I was very involved with and Mike Tracy.
I would say that if it hadn't been for Roy, we would never have got this off the ground. You know, he was the only person who encouraged us, and he did actually get us some money, didn't you, to repair the vent on the top, which needs doing again. But no, Roy was the only person who gave us any help at all. And I'm serious. I don't think that we'd have managed to do it if we hadn't had the sort of encouragement that we got from Roy. I mean, it is really quite extraordinary, actually, some of these things where they want you to do something, but they can't actually agree to doing anything that will facilitate it. But well, and also you see now, like when I said I put that roll in the mill, I was probably 14 or 15 when I did that, and I was working all my summer holidays, and I learned a huge amount from Jess, you know, woodwork and stuff. And of course you can't do it now, can you? You just can't do it. And I think it's a pity, really, isn't it?
Okay, I think we've got someone on Zoom.
We've got a question in the chat. Is a move to Boreham, I think it was, still on the cards?
Well, yes. I mean, I can't really comment. Yes, I think so. But again, it's a bit like swimming in treacle. It really is. Well, it's the same as we have had with everything else. It's just a bit more difficult to deal with, I think. But we'll have to. We need more space for storage and stuff, and we can't really operate properly. You have to be very fleet of foot, don't you, now? So you have to change as the markets change. I can remember one year, 25% of our feed tonnage stopped keeping pigs in 1 year, and you've got to be able to adapt to that and that sort of thing quickly. And we hampered.
No, I mean, if anyone on the call wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, then please feel free. It doesn't have to be in the chat.
Anyone in the room got a further question? Neil, who's on mute, do you want to unmute Neil and ask a question?
I don't want to ask a question, but I'm just so impressed with everything you've told us this evening, Peter. It's been so interesting, and you've gone over a range of things that we just sort of partly are associated with or understand in part, but you filled in a lot of gaps for me. So I just want to say thank you very much indeed.
Oh, well, thank you. I hope you've all enjoyed it. And if you know things that I got wrong or I haven't known, I'd be interested to hear. I mean, I'm not a historian or anything like that. So, but it is surprising when you look through these things and you look at the different accounts of the same thing, how different they are. And you've got to get back, I mean, to the base evidence so that it's not hearsay. You can be sure that it's correct. It's quite difficult we've got a fairly good family tree, but William came down and I was trying to work out all these different Williams, you know, and it was just doing my head in, you know, and when you get the dates and you find one was milling here at that date, then you've got to go back and see which one, you know, and like with the sugar plant, that was his sons, his two sons. There was marriage. I don't know who the Reed was. And they were his sons, but you've got to go and work out the ages and to try and get it right. But it is quite interesting, but it's quite difficult to do.
Right. If no one else is still, oh,
Just one, you mentioned the sugar vapors again, just then.
Yeah.
I don't, was there any power source taken from the river there, or was it just a?
No, I think it's steam. Now, when was it built in? I can't remember. It's in the 1800s. No, because they used steam in it to do all the cooking and things. So it wasn't direct heat, because you can have problems, you know, with burning the sugar, and you can get dust explosions. Sugar's like flour, explosive, and so they obviously had steam. I read that they used steam to do it. It was quite a modern thing. So I don't think, it doesn't look like it, does it there? And they certainly took barges of flour to London from Hoe Mill, didn't they? They took flour in barges to London. So I should think probably there wasn't another weir there. It's quite wide, isn't it? I imagine they put it there because it was and by the road and big enough to turn things around. I thought. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know.
I just assumed that the sugar beet would be mashing up. And
They cut it all up. I don't think they did it quite the same as they do it now. And I think they use lime, don't they, to clarify it. So whether there was a big lime works at Malden, wasn't there, on the quay, whether they brought, you know, quick lime from there, I don't know. But the British sugar factories all have lime kilns in them to produce the lime for clarifying. I really, honestly, I don't know.
okay. Anyone else? Yeah, all right. Well, I was born in Charlton, and I've learned a lot tonight about marriages, which I didn't know, which I found really fascinating. But can we once again show our appreciation to Peter for the talk tonight? I'm sure everyone's enjoyed that, and we'll close the meeting now. So thank you very much, Peter.